The night pressed heavy against the old house as Thomas lay awake in his bed, every sound from the attic crawling into his chest like a blade. He tried to tell himself it was only the wood shifting. Still, the noise was sharp. Thomas whispered, "It's nothing, just the wind." But his voice betrayed him with a tremble. A scream suddenly erupted above, slicing the silence like shattered glass. His body froze, drenched in cold sweat. The narrator described how Thomas's breath came shallow, and the air felt suffocating, thick with an unseen dread that wrapped around him like chains. He could not escape the sound. It lingered. The scream twisted into a whisper, low and unnatural, curling down through the ceiling as though it were alive. Thomas gripped the sheets. His heart pounded so violently that it felt like it might burst from his chest. Thomas said, "Who's there?" His voice cracked, thin and fragile. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the scream itself. The house waited. Every shadow seemed to lean toward him, eager. The narrator described the attic door above as groaning faintly, wood stretching like it wanted to breathe. Thomas's eyes locked on the ceiling, knowing the sound belonged to something not human. The voice whispered again, faint but deliberate. It said his name, dragging each syllable like claws across stone. Thomas shivered, unable to blink, unable to breathe. The house felt alive. Thomas said, "Leave me alone," but his words collapsed against the air, absorbed by the darkness. His hands trembled as the whisper slithered through the walls. Every hair on his skin rose. The narrator described how Thomas curled into himself, desperate for the sound to stop, yet knowing it wouldn't. The air grew colder, his breath visible in the room, though no window was open. The terror was absolute. The final whisper came softer, closer, like it pressed against his ear. The attic above creaked. Something waited. The night had only just begun. The house held its breath as Thomas sat in silence, unable to shake the sound of his name whispered from above. His mind raced with memories of childhood nights, when he thought monsters hid in corners. Tonight, it felt real. Thomas muttered, "I have to know," though every part of him screamed to stay still. His legs shook as he pushed himself upright. The narrator described the floor beneath him groaning in protest. The air grew colder as he approached the ladder that led to the attic. The walls seemed to hum faintly, vibrating with something unseen. Thomas clutched a flashlight, its beam trembling as much as his hand. The silence pressed so heavily that even his heartbeat felt too loud. Each step forward was agony, his chest tightening with every inch closer to the ladder. The attic loomed above him like a mouth waiting to swallow. The narrator described how Thomas stopped at the base of the ladder, sweat dripping, his eyes darting to every corner. The whisper had stopped, but the dread lingered. The quiet was worse than the sound. Thomas stared at the ladder, frozen by the weight of decision. He remembered his father once warning him never to go up there after dark. His father had laughed, but there had been fear hidden in his eyes. The narrator described how the silence throbbed like a wound. Thomas placed his hand on the ladder rung, wood splintering slightly under his touch. His chest rose and fell quickly. Thomas whispered, "Just a quick look," though his voice cracked as though betraying the lie. He lifted one foot onto the rung, the creak so loud it cut through the air like thunder. The attic above seemed to shift. A low shuffle crawled across the ceiling. The beam of his flashlight shook against the wood, casting frantic shadows that seemed to move even after the light had passed. The narrator described how Thomas pulled his foot back, trembling, his breath catching. He realized the attic wasn't empty. Something waited, and it knew he was coming. The night deepened outside, wind rattling broken shutters, but inside, Thomas stood paralyzed before the ladder. His mind screamed to run, but his body rooted him in place. The narrator described how Thomas pressed the flashlight tighter, knuckles white, sweat streaming down his face. He imagined the creature above listening, waiting for the exact moment of weakness. Thomas whispered, It's feeding on me, the words trembling out before he realized he'd spoken them. His own voice scared him more than the silence. The air thickened, pressing like invisible hands around his throat. Every corner of the room seemed to breathe, the wallpaper bending subtly, shadows pulsing faintly. The narrator described how Thomas turned away from the ladder, retreating toward the bed, yet his eyes never left the attic door. His heart knew this was only the beginning. Thomas collapsed onto the edge of his bed, trembling as though every bone rattled loose. His mind clawed for reason, but the memory of the whisper was carved into his thoughts. The narrator described how silence stretched in the room, but every second felt alive, carrying weight. His breath came ragged, shallow, like he was drowning in the air itself. Thomas muttered, "I can't escape this," his voice nearly breaking. His eyes darted back to the ceiling where the attic door loomed, patient and waiting. The night dragged on, relentless. His exhaustion battled with fear, but each time his eyes closed, the whisper echoed in his skull. He realized sleep would not come tonight. The narrator described how Thomas sat hunched forward, face buried in his shaking hands. The house stood still, but something above shifted again, reminding him it was watching. Always watching. The morning sun broke weakly through dusty curtains, but Thomas sat at the kitchen table with hollow eyes. He had not slept. Every whisper from the attic replayed in his mind, like poison dripping endlessly. The narrator described how Thomas stared at the untouched mug of coffee, steam long faded. His hands shook faintly as he tried to grip the handle. The silence of daylight felt deceptive, a cruel trick. Mother Laura entered quietly, her voice gentle yet laced with worry. "Mother Laura," said Thomas, "you look ill. Did you dream again?" Thomas lifted his head slowly, eyes rimmed red, haunted by the night. Thomas forced a small smile. Thomas said, "It was nothing, just noise in the attic." The words stumbled, fragile and empty. He hated lying, yet the truth felt too monstrous to speak aloud. The narrator described how Mother Laura studied her son, pain creasing her face. Her heart carried unspoken guilt, knowing his childhood nights had always been riddled with fear. The past was clawing back. The clock ticked loudly, each second a hammer against Thomas's nerves. He wanted to believe daylight could protect him, but the memory of the whisper lingered in his ears. The attic never slept. The narrator described how Mother Laura placed her hand gently on Thomas's shoulder. She whispered that he needed rest, but Thomas recoiled slightly, the thought of sleep feeling like surrender to the monster. Thomas said, "I can't rest. Something is wrong up there." His voice cracked, raw with fear. Mother Laura frowned, her gaze heavy with disbelief, yet her silence revealed unspoken dread. The walls seemed to groan faintly, a reminder of the creature above. Thomas shivered, eyes darting upward. The sound might have been the house, but it felt deliberate, like mockery. The narrator described how Thomas rose suddenly, chair scraping sharply across the floor. His resolve mixed with fear, desperate to cling to control. He knew pretending would not make the attic vanish. Later that afternoon, Thomas walked into the small living room, the weight of the attic above always present. Television flickered faintly, playing but unheard. He could not focus. The narrator described how his cousin Emma entered, her youthful energy a contrast to the heavy air. Cousin Emma said, "You're pale, Thomas. You've been locked in your head again, haven't you?" Her tone carried both concern and impatience. Thomas attempted to mask his dread. Thomas said, "It's just the attic, strange noises, nothing more." His voice betrayed the lie. Cousin Emma narrowed her eyes, sensing something unsaid. The shadows in the room shifted with the setting sun, long and reaching. The creaks above grew louder, though no one else seemed to notice. Thomas's hand tightened into a fist. The narrator described how Cousin Emma leaned against the wall, arms folded. Her rational mind dismissed his fear, yet she felt a chill in the air that words could not explain. The conversation grew sharper as the room darkened with evening. Cousin Emma said, "You've been obsessed since childhood. There is nothing in that attic." Her voice cut, sharp like a blade. Thomas snapped back, his voice shaking. Thomas said, "You didn't hear it. It spoke my name. It knows I'm here." His hands trembled, and his eyes shone with desperation. The narrator described how Mother Laura entered, holding her rosary tightly. She urged them both to stop arguing, her voice wavering. She had heard enough fragments of the night to know fear was real. Thomas pressed his palms to his face, fighting the urge to scream. The attic creaked again above them, louder this time, as if responding to the chaos below. Silence crushed the room. The narrator described how Cousin Emma crossed her arms tighter, her skepticism cracking slightly, though she refused to admit it. The shadows pressed closer, the house alive with secrets. Night returned, darker than before. Thomas sat alone in his room, every breath shallow, every sound magnified. The house seemed to lean inward, listening with the monster above. The narrator described how he clutched the flashlight tighter than ever, knowing sleep would not come. Mother Laura's words echoed in his mind, pleading for rest. But rest meant surrender. Thomas whispered, "It's waiting for me." His eyes never left the attic door, looming like a second heartbeat in the house. The dread grew thicker, swallowing him whole. The silence fractured when a thud rattled directly overhead. Dust drifted from the ceiling onto his bed. Thomas flinched violently, his chest seizing as fear swallowed him raw. The narrator described how the whisper returned faintly, curling downward into his ear. It dragged his name again, slower this time, hungrier. He knew the attic wanted him, and it would never stop. The night pressed down like a suffocating blanket as Thomas sat rigid in his chair, the silence alive with expectation. Every creak of the attic groaned as though the house itself was breathing with the monster. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, flickering like phantoms. Thomas whispered, "It is waiting for me." His words cracked as the cold air burned in his chest. The narrator described how the lights dimmed and brightened faintly, though no storm raged outside. His pulse throbbed painfully in his temples. Suddenly, the air snapped with a sound, a dragging scrape overhead, heavy and slow, like claws etched across wood. Thomas clutched his chest as terror anchored him to the chair. The sound stopped, then returned, closer, heavier. He knew it was deliberate. The narrator described how Thomas's knuckles turned white around the flashlight handle. His chest heaved, and his eyes widened toward the ceiling, pleading for silence. But silence did not come. The following morning, Thomas forced himself outside into the pale light of dawn, desperate for escape. The air smelled of wet earth, yet even here, the house loomed behind him like a predator watching. He clenched his fists, his nails cutting into his palms. Cousin Emma walked up the narrow path, her auburn hair glinting faintly. Cousin Emma said, "You look worse every day. You need help, Thomas." Her eyes held irritation mixed with concern. Thomas shook his head, refusing her words. Thomas said, "You don't understand. It is not just creaks. It speaks to me." His voice quivered, each syllable trembling with fear. The narrator described how Cousin Emma rolled her eyes, though unease twisted faintly in her features. The wind pressed through the trees with a hollow sound, like whispers chasing them both. That evening, Thomas sat at the kitchen table again, flashlight beside him like a weapon. The air throbbed faintly with vibrations from above, subtle yet constant, like a second heartbeat in the house. Mother Laura entered, her rosary clutched in trembling hands. Mother Laura said, "Pray with me, Thomas. Whatever it is, prayer will drive it away." Her voice wavered between faith and desperation. Thomas slammed his hands on the table, his voice ragged. Thomas said, "Prayer will not silence it. It feeds on fear, not faith." The narrator described how Mother Laura's lips parted in shock. She stepped back, pressing rosary harder against her chest. The attic groaned again, louder, shaking dust free. Silence followed. Then a faint laugh, muffled, yet clear enough to twist Thomas's stomach into knots. Later that night, Cousin Emma returned, determined to prove the attic harmless. Cousin Emma said, "I will go up there myself and show you there is nothing." Her voice rang with defiance. Thomas leapt to his feet, pale and frantic. Thomas said, "Don't. It wants you to. It waits for weakness." The narrator described how Cousin Emma rolled her eyes, dismissive yet nervous. She placed her foot on the ladder rung, wood groaning beneath her weight. The air turned icy, their breath visible though no window was open. The whisper slithered downward again, curling through the silence, this time speaking Emma's name. Cousin Emma froze, her hand trembling on the rung. Thomas lunged forward, pulling her back with desperate strength, both of them collapsing onto the floor. The house was silent again, but silence was worse than sound. Thomas sat hunched in the corner, hands trembling, staring at the ladder. Cousin Emma sat beside him, shaken, her skepticism cracking. Cousin Emma whispered, "It knew my name." Her voice trembled with disbelief. Thomas shook violently, whispering back, "It knows us all. It waits for the right moment." The narrator described how Mother Laura knelt nearby, rosary pressed to her lips, eyes closed tight as silent prayers tumbled. The air grew thick with dread, pressing like invisible hands. From the attic above, 3 slow knocks echoed downward, deliberate and mocking. The house seemed to breathe, alive with something ancient. The night returned heavy, the walls sighing like lungs. Thomas sat rigid in his chair, while Mother Laura prayed softly in the corner. Her rosary beads clicked in her trembling hands. Cousin Emma paced by the window, her disbelief beginning to crack. The narrator described how the attic above groaned louder, dragging and pounding as though something pressed violently against the boards. Dust rained slowly, coating the floor in gray. Thomas whispered, "It is stronger tonight." His voice cracked, desperate and broken. Mother Laura whispered a prayer louder, begging for protection. Suddenly, the air shifted cold, and a figure appeared in the corner, faint, translucent, face twisted with agony. The figure was Father John, Thomas's father, whose death years ago had left scars that never healed. Father John's mouth opened, but no words came, only a rattling moan that cut through the silence like broken glass. Thomas stumbled to his feet, his breath choking as his eyes fixed on the ghost of Father John. Thomas said, You should not be here." His voice faltered, breaking into silence. Father John's form flickered, his face showing anguish and regret. The narrator described how Mother Laura's sobs escaped her, clutching her chest as tears streaked down her face. She whispered, "I told you he was never at peace." Cousin Emma gasped, her rational certainty collapsing under the weight of the apparition before her. The ghost raised a trembling hand, pointing upward toward the attic door. The gesture was deliberate, sharp, and filled with warning. The boards above groaned louder, as though acknowledging the revelation. A low growl seeped through the ceiling, deep and guttural, like the creature mocked the family's fear. The narrator described how the air became suffocating, pressing against their lungs like invisible hands. Father John's ghost began to convulse, his form warping as though torn apart by unseen claws. Thomas shouted, "Stop this!" His cry broke into a sob as he reached forward. The specter twisted violently, his face stretched in agony, mouth wide in a silent scream. Mother Laura collapsed to her knees, her sobs rising louder as she begged for mercy. Cousin Emma clutched Thomas's arm, her voice trembling as she whispered, "It is feeding on him." The attic thundered overhead, a deafening crash shaking the beams as though the house itself would collapse. Then, silence returned, and Father John was gone, leaving only the echo of despair and the cold stink of death. Thomas sank to the floor, his body trembling violently. The narrator described how Mother Laura crawled toward him, her face streaked with tears, whispering, "He suffered because of us, because of this house." Her voice shook with guilt. Cousin Emma crouched beside them, finally broken, her skeptical shell shattered. Cousin Emma said, "If this is real, we cannot stay here." Her voice trembled but carried urgency. Thomas's eyes darted toward the attic door, his breathing jagged, the memory of Father John's suffering carved into his chest. The attic moaned again, long and hollow, as though mocking their pain. Thomas whispered, "It will take us all." His words bled into silence, and the walls themselves seemed to lean closer, suffocating them with dread. The house was silent again, yet the silence pulsed with menace. Thomas sat against the wall, hollow eyes fixed on the ceiling where the attic door loomed. The narrator described how Mother Laura's prayers faltered into broken sobs, her faith shattered by the torment of Father John's ghost. Cousin Emma's hands shook as she lit a candle, its weak flame flickering wildly as though even fire feared the house. Thomas whispered, "He was warning us. Something worse waits above." His voice was hoarse, raw with fear. The attic responded with 3 slow knocks, deliberate, heavy, shaking dust down into their hair. The sound was not random. It was a message. The narrator described how all 3 froze, bound together by the certainty that the monster was no longer hiding, it was preparing. The night was suffocating, the silence broken only by the occasional groan of the attic boards. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, hollow-eyed, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. Mother Laura whispered prayers under her breath, her faith cracked but clinging to hope. Cousin Emma paced near the door, her steps sharp, her face pale with unease. Suddenly, a knock echoed from the back door, slow and deliberate. The narrator described how Thomas froze, his breath caught, his eyes darting to the shadowed hallway. Mother Laura clutched her rosary tighter, whispering, "No one should come at this hour." The door creaked open, and an old man stepped into the light. His face was lined with age, his eyes dark with knowledge. It was Neighbor Samuel, a man who had lived in the village longer than anyone. Neighbor Samuel said, "You should never have stayed in this house." The narrator described how Thomas rose from the chair, his voice unsteady. Thomas said, "You know about it, don't you?" Neighbor Samuel's eyes narrowed, his silence heavy before he finally spoke. Neighbor Samuel said, "That thing in your attic has lived here longer than you, longer than me. It feeds on fear, and your family has given it plenty." Mother Laura gasped, her hand pressed tightly to her mouth. Cousin Emma whispered sharply, "This is madness, ghost stories to frighten children." But her voice trembled with doubt. Neighbor Samuel stepped further into the room, his coat dripping rain, his presence heavy. He placed an old book on the table, its cover cracked and blackened. Neighbor Samuel said, "This house was cursed long before you were born." The narrator described how Neighbor Samuel opened the book, brittle pages crackling under his weathered hands. Strange symbols and sketches of twisted figures filled the pages. Neighbor Samuel said, "This house was built on ground that was never meant to be disturbed. The creature above is bound to this place, feeding on those who live here." Thomas leaned closer, his face pale, his voice shaking. Thomas said, "Why us? Why my family?" Neighbor Samuel's voice dropped lower, rough as gravel. Neighbor Samuel said, "Because your bloodline awakened it. Every fear, every nightmare, it drinks from you like water." Mother Laura broke into sobs, clutching the rosary tighter. Cousin Emma shook her head, whispering, "No, it cannot be true." The attic groaned again, heavy and mocking, as though agreeing. The air grew heavy, pressing down on them like stone. Neighbor Samuel said, "The creature cannot be destroyed, only contained. But it takes strength and sacrifice." His eyes bore into Thomas with a grim weight. The narrator described how Thomas's knees weakened, his hands trembling violently. Mother Laura gasped, crying out, "No, not again. It already took Father John." Her words broke into sobs. Cousin Emma's face hardened, though her eyes glistened. Cousin Emma said, "If there is a way, we have to try." Thomas whispered, "What kind of sacrifice?" His voice cracked with dread. Neighbor Samuel closed the book slowly, his silence heavier than the answer itself. The attic boards above let out a long groan, followed by a faint laugh, cruel and deliberate. The candlelight flickered violently, as though the house itself listened. Neighbor Samuel leaned closer, his whisper cold and deliberate. Neighbor Samuel said, "It will never stop. It will take until nothing is left of you. But you can bind it again if you dare." Thomas shook, his eyes burning with both terror and defiance. Thomas said, "Tell me how." His voice was raw, desperate. The narrator described how neighbor Samuel's face darkened, his eyes reflecting the weight of centuries of knowledge. Mother Laura wept quietly, whispering prayers, while cousin Emma stood frozen, torn between doubt and belief. The attic above answered with a deep, thunderous knock, rattling the walls. The message was clear. It was listening. The house groaned, alive with the monster's hunger. The storm outside rattled the shutters, but inside the house, the true storm gathered above. The narrator described how Thomas sat rigid, his flashlight clenched, while Mother Laura rocked slowly in her chair, whispering broken prayers. Cousin Emma stood near the ladder, her arms wrapped around herself, trembling. Neighbor Samuel leaned forward, voice low and sharp. Neighbor Samuel said, "The creature is tied to your blood, Thomas. It feeds because of you." Thomas's chest heaved as his eyes widened. Thomas said, "You mean it hunts me, not the house?" Neighbor Samuel nodded gravely. The attic groaned in answer, dust falling in slow spirals from the ceiling. The narrator described how Mother Laura cried out, "It cursed us when you were born. That's why your father feared the dark." The silence after her words was jagged, cutting through them like a blade. The attic floorboards shook violently, and a guttural laugh seeped through the ceiling, mocking every word. The narrator described how cousin Emma's face went pale as she whispered, "It knows the truth." Thomas staggered back, his breath quickening. Thomas said, "This is my fault. It is bound to me." His voice broke, raw with despair. Neighbor Samuel slammed the book shut, the sound like thunder. Neighbor Samuel said, "It cannot be killed, but you can bind it, only through blood sacrifice." Mother Laura gasped, falling to her knees, begging, "Not my son, please, not my son." Her cries tore through the room, but the attic responded with heavy pounding, deliberate and cruel. Thomas covered his ears, but the laughter dug deep, echoing inside his skull like claws raking his mind. The narrator described how the candlelight flickered violently, shadows crawling unnaturally across the walls. Cousin Emma stepped forward, her voice shaking but determined. Cousin Emma said, "If sacrifice is needed, it should not be Thomas. There must be another way." Thomas turned to her, his voice breaking. Thomas said, "You do not understand. It has always been me." Mother Laura clutched his arm, screaming through her sobs, "I will not lose you too." Neighbor Samuel shook his head, his expression carved with grim certainty. Neighbor Samuel said, "Blood awakened it. Blood must bind it. There is no other way." The attic groaned again, louder, as though savoring the conflict below. The sound of nails dragging across wood screeched from above, making their skin crawl. The storm outside roared, lightning flashing through the windows, illuminating the fear carved on their faces. The narrator described how Thomas stepped toward the attic ladder, his body trembling but his jaw set with determination. Thomas said, "If this ends with me, then it ends tonight." Mother Laura wailed, throwing herself forward to block him. Mother Laura said, "You will not give yourself to that monster." Cousin Emma pulled her back, tears in her eyes, whispering, "He might be the only one who can stop it." Neighbor Samuel's voice cut through them all, cold and unwavering. Neighbor Samuel said, "If he refuses, it will consume you all. This is the truth." The attic responded with a long, guttural growl, shaking the beams as though laughing at their despair. The narrator described how Thomas placed his hand on the ladder, his body shaking, his face pale but eyes filled with grim resolve. Mother Laura sobbed uncontrollably, collapsing into Cousin Emma's arms. Cousin Emma whispered, "If you go up there, it will not let you come back." Thomas turned, whispering hoarsely, "Then it ends with me." Neighbor Samuel watched silently, his eyes dark with both pity and inevitability. Suddenly, the attic door rattled violently, slamming open as darkness poured downward like smoke, filling the air with cold rot. A voice erupted, twisted and guttural, calling Thomas's name with venom. The narrator described how Thomas's hand tightened on the ladder, his breath trembling, and in that moment, he knew the monster was tied not only to his blood, but to his very soul. The attic door slammed open with a thunderous crack, darkness spilling downward like liquid smoke. The narrator described how Thomas stepped forward, flashlight in one hand, the old book clutched in the other. Mother Laura clung to Cousin Emma, sobbing as the cold air filled the room. Neighbor Samuel raised his voice, above the storm outside. Neighbor Samuel said, "If you face it, do not falter. One moment of fear will bind you forever." Thomas whispered hoarsely, "It already has." The air trembled as a guttural voice called his name, stretched and broken. The house shook violently, windows rattling, and the floor groaned as if alive. The narrator described how Thomas placed his foot on the ladder and began to climb, each rung creaking beneath his weight. Hut-hole. Shadows curled downward like hands grasping for him, and the stench of rot grew thicker with every step. The attic swallowed Thomas as he pulled himself upward into darkness. The narrator described how the air was thick, suffocating, filled with whispers that scraped against his ears. His flashlight flickered weakly, barely cutting the gloom. In the corner, a shape moved, immense, hunched, its skin crawling like shifting shadows. The monster's eyes glowed faintly, reflecting his own terror back at him. Thomas said, "I know you now." His voice trembled, yet defiance bled through. The creature snarled, the sound vibrating the beams. Below, Mother Laura screamed his name, while Cousin Emma's sobs shook the silence. Neighbor Samuel's voice rose in ritual words, the book's power spilling upward. The monster lunged, its form blurring between solid and smoke, filling the attic with thunderous roars. The attic roared with chaos as the creature surged forward, its claws scraping against the beams, showering splinters across the floor. The narrator described how Thomas raised the book, chanting the words Neighbor Samuel had taught him. The pages glowed faintly, the air crackling with unseen energy. The monster recoiled, its shrieks shaking the walls. Mother Laura prayed louder, her voice raw with desperation, while Cousin Emma clutched her tighter, both trembling. Neighbor Samuel shouted, "Do not stop, Thomas, bind it with your blood." Thomas gritted his teeth, slicing his palm with a jagged nail, letting blood drip onto the pages. The glow flared brighter, searing the shadows. The monster screamed, its body writhing like smoke torn by fire. The attic shook as the binding ritual intensified. The narrator described how Thomas staggered, his body drained by the energy pouring from his blood. The book pulsed with violent light, threatening to tear itself apart. The monster clawed at him, its massive form collapsing and reforming with every strike. Thomas shouted, "You will not have them!" His voice broke through the chaos. Mother Laura cried his name, her body trembling as she clung to Cousin Emma. Neighbor Samuel pushed forward, chanting louder, his eyes burning with fierce determination. The creature's form split apart, shadows screaming into every corner, then surging back together. Thomas dropped to his knees, the book glowing blindingly, his body trembling as if every bone might shatter. The final moment erupted in unbearable silence, broken only by the monster's scream. The narrator described how the attic exploded with light, shadows burning away as the creature's form twisted violently. Thomas collapsed against the floor, the book falling from his grasp, blood staining the wood. The monster's voice echoed one last time, whispering, "You are mine," before vanishing into smoke. The silence that followed was haunting, heavy, and eternal. Mother Laura screamed, racing up the ladder, clutching Thomas's limp body. Cousin Emma followed, her face streaked with tears, while Neighbor Samuel stood frozen, his eyes filled with sorrow. Thomas's chest rose faintly, a shallow breath proving he still lived, but his eyes stared hollow and distant. The attic door slammed shut on its own, sealing the darkness inside once more.